Okay, everything working great. Okay, so very nice to be running this podcast for the first time. It's been a sort of dream to try and get it working, so thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, everything working, jolly good, no gremlins. Basically, with this podcast, what I want to explore is the interface between music, art, and broadly speaking, transcendence. So basically, what I wanted to ask was what aspects for you in music and art do you find sustaining, spiritually, psychologically sustaining? And do you feel there's anything phenomenologically distinct about music, something that is outside of ordinary experience?
I think there's a lot about music in particular and art in general
Mm-hmm.
that I find spiritually and psychologically sustaining. I'd start off by saying that great art is inexhaustible. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
no matter how many times you go back to it, you always find something new, and in a way, it grows with you. You change as a person, and your perception of a piece of music that you're playing or listening to would change with you. And it also forces you to look at it differently. You realize something that you haven't seen or heard before, and all of a sudden you feel that you cannot approach a certain work of art the way you've done it before. And this intrinsic challenge, I think, has a very redemptive aspect to it. I see it all the time when I revisit certain pieces of music that I play, or even that I listen to, if they're not for piano. I'm sure you find the same.
Oh yeah.
And this inexplicability of art, whereby you know its value because you can sense it, and yet you can't quite put your finger on it. You cannot exactly say where it is or
Hmm.
what is it that makes it what it is. That I think also makes it very, very sustaining, because it's always shrouded in a cloud of mystery.
Mm-hmm.
Music, perhaps even more so than literature or the visual arts, because music at a fundamental level is abstract in a way that representative art like painting isn't.
Yeah.
So you look at a painting, and most of the time the painting depicts something.
Yeah, sort of there's a kind of matter of fact quality about painting sometimes.
Yes,
Um,
even if the painting is of absolutely transcendental beauty. I mean,
yeah, I mean, often when I
we all
look at
have our examples
painting,
for that,
I
but
mean, what I was going to say about painting actually is that sometimes it's taking the subject and kind of transfiguring it through the
yes,
medium. You know, it's kind of elevating the subject matter to something. Yeah,
elevating the subject matter through aesthetics, through
yeah.
the artist's skill, sense and sense of beauty. And the same can be said for literature, but music at the fundamental level is abstract. I mean, it describes itself before it describes any external emotions. I mean, I'm sure there are many emotions which went into the creation of a Haydn string
Mm.
quartet. But when you listen to it, it really is a self-sufficient organism.
Oh, absolutely,
And
yeah. I mean,
and and
music is almost like a compass. Actually,
yes, yes, and
it
yet
kind of has a directional quality, but without, yeah, as you say, almost has a quasi-religious quality. Actually, where it kind of
yes,
intimates the point, but without actually touching on it directly. Because as soon
without
as you
touching on
touch
it
it, it
directly,
vanishes. Yeah.
and it's quite miraculous to me how something so abstract can have so much sustenance to it. I mean, there's certain pieces of music you listen to that I you just cannot help but think that there's something true in it.
Hmm. Okay.
Any slow movement of a Haydn quartet has that, and yet you don't really know why it's true. I mean, but you just know that it is, and that's why I say it's self sufficient. And
yeah.
whereas I think all art touches upon that, music probably does that in a more, in a more fundamental way.
Yeah, it's through that abstraction actually that allows a sort of range of experience that, yeah, transforming the individual through something that's actually experienced quite collectively in a lot of ways. I mean, obviously you can nowadays, of course, you can listen to music, through your headphones, and you kind of experience it as a solo event. But actually, in performance, historically, it's something that has to be communicated as well. There's a kind of moment of recreation, including the
Yes.
creation. Yeah.
Yes, and of course, we benefit enormously from the abundance of recordings that we have. That
Hmm.
on a tiny little device, you can listen to all of the Bruckner symphonies,
Yeah.
in one day, and yet there are things which cannot really be recreated, I think, in recordings. Namely, the aspect of silence.
Yes.
There is
Absolutely. Yeah.
nothing in the world that can reproduce the feeling of 50 or 500 or 2,000 people in a hall listening to a pause.
Yes.
Nothing
There's a kind of aliveness actually,
Yes.
within
Uh,
as like a vitality within that moment of almost seemingly nothing happening, but actually everything is
but
happening.
everything is
Is
happening,
there's a
and
kind of expectation almost. Yeah.
and you can just feel the tension in the air, and the ball is truly in the hands of the performer or performers with what
Hmm.
to do with that silence.
I think it's quite crucial actually to the sort of interpretative aspect, because I mean one of the things that I've often been influenced by. Are you familiar with the Romanian conductor Sergiu Celibidache?
Of course.
I mean, he was obviously a big proponent, actually, of kind of anti-recording, even though I don't fully
Right.
agree with quite the extreme position.
Yeah.
But I think actually his approach, where the temporal aspect of performance is so crucial and integral to the apprehension of the whole.
Hmm.
It can't be reduced actually, and sometimes recording can, so as you rightfully pointed out, it kind of reduces that quality somehow. It takes away some essential framing, for lack of a
Hmm.
better term. There's a kind of like a space within which the music happens that's, as you say, it's kind of created in that silence actually.
Exactly, yes. And what is an interesting case, I believe Heinrich Schenker wrote about it in either private correspondences or even in his diary.
Okay.
The very influential music theorist Heinrich Schenker. He wrote something to the effect of how great it is that we have recordings now, and I can listen to my beloved Tristan on my recording device in my bathrobe. And then a few years later, he wrote, "But should I be listening to Tristan
Mm,
in my bathrobe?"
yeah.
And I think his initial enthusiasm was quelled by maybe a sense of being alienated from the music. When on one hand he's listening to Tristan, on the other hand he has his breakfast in front of him. It produced a rather unfamiliar feeling, one that by now has become completely commonplace.
Yeah, I mean, it's completely normal nowadays, because
Exactly.
it's how we consume music primarily, actually.
Yeah, yeah.
And another thing I wanted to touch on today, I wonder what kind of implications does that have for creativity from a composer's point of view as well, and also for us as performers. If an audience doesn't necessarily understand or agree with the kind of principle of, I mean, I guess you can say it's almost like sanctity. Almost, it's almost like creating a sense of space in which there's a certain sense of order, which allows for the kind of and apprehension of the material being presented. As you say, you don't listen to Tristan and Isolde in your bathrobe
Yeah.
over your Weetabix, whilst maybe having a go at the daily crossword. It almost
Yeah.
seems like a sort of, there seems to be almost a mismatch of principles here at play.
Yes, that's a good question. I, for me, the guiding principle would be primarily what to avoid,
Mhm.
and I I was thinking about it quite a lot because I just made a recording, and I had to consciously remind myself not to fall into the trap of trying to produce something perfect and sterile,
Okay.
because even if it happens, from my point of view, it's quite unfulfilling. And the antidote to that, I think, is to imagine that you're playing for a live audience.
Okay. I mean, out of interest, how would you categorize something that's sterile in a recording? It's a difficult question, I know, but it's something worth thinking about.
How would I? Well, I would categorize it as something where technical perfection takes precedence over emotional and expressive richness.
Yeah.
That's my definition of something sterile. I mean, we've heard plenty of recordings like this, and unfortunately live performances too, which have now started trying.
Well, yeah, because I mean, one of the things that I've thought about a lot actually is, I mean, some of my experience with audiences, and obviously there's obviously a huge diversity of opinion on this matter, but I've definitely come across some people which they sort of listen to kind of pitch perfect recording and almost have an expectation to experience something like that in the concert hall, which is kind of a strange thing to me, because obviously that's crucially not really an integral part of the performance. The technique is merely a vehicle. It's not really
it's not the end in itself. Well, yeah, perhaps there's some people like that. I actually find that there are many people who crave precisely that which you cannot get in a recording.
A sense of realism, actually, yeah.
I actually find that very often. Even if people don't say that in these explicit words, they'll come up to you and say, I've listened to recordings of this Beethoven sonata so many times, but hearing it live is such a different experience, and now I truly feel like I understand the piece. And they're 100% right.
Yeah.
I feel this way with certain operas that I've listened to, and all of a sudden I hear them for the first time in the theatre.
I experienced a similar thing actually, hearing St. Matthew's Passion live for the first time.
Exactly.
And it was quite a, dramatically different experience. Even though, of course, maybe the ensembles in different places, there might be maybe a higher quality of musicians perhaps, but there is a very substantial difference hearing it live, because it really brings the entire experience to really visceral. Actually, it's a visceral quality.
And it's a communal undertaking. You're one with everybody else in the hall or in the cathedral, and you're also one with the performers. I mean, you climb that mountain together.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah,
and I think
it's interesting. I was just thinking, with this kind of concept of technical perfection, I do think that we live in a increasingly commercialized world, and I think there seems to be, at least on the organizational side of things, an appetite, it appears, for this kind of sheen, this polish in every aspect. And I think a lot of people I've talked to many people about this with competitions, for example, where because it's quite difficult to actually, as we said earlier, to kind of put your finger on what it is that makes a musically satisfying performance. It's actually quite difficult to bunk it up rather than debunk. You want to try and hoist up all these good aspects of it. It's very difficult to actually put your finger on it. There tends to be a way of objectifying a performance based on its technical attributes, and I wonder if there's some way to sort of like shift that. And I think increasingly I notice the quality of judgment almost, which it's interesting. I mean, I'm quite interested to see what your thoughts.
I actually think that the pendulum is moving a bit on that front.
Okay.
And you have to keep in mind it's been swinging to one direction for many decades. I mean, roughly speaking, and of course there are many exceptions to this rule.
Yeah.
But I think musical taste changed quite dramatically after the Second World War.
Okay.
When technically improved recordings came on the market, the market started demanding a certain type of playing, which produced some phenomenal recordings which we cherish for generations hence, of course. But if you listen to conductors who were popular, let's say in the 1930s, like Willem Mengelberg, my personal hero, and Karajan in the 50s, within a generation, it's a completely different mindset, a completely different approach, different priorities, and some things were gained. On the other hand, some things were also lost, and I think the music world went in that direction quite steadily, and I sense it's actually turning back now. Then that doesn't mean that we're going to have another Mengelberg in the next 10 years, but I think there's more space for different priorities, and even conversations I had with people in the, for lack of a better word, industry. I hate this word, but I have had conversations with movers and shakers, let's say, in the music world, who said that we've had enough of one technically flawless interpretation of a Tchaikovsky concerto after another. Can you give us something else? So I think it's actually maybe a spiritual need, almost a spiritual need for something that will bring us something that we haven't. Not only that we haven't heard, but that we didn't expect to hear.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, one of the things that kind of pops out to me on this subject is, this is one of the questions that was kind of on my list here, is, treating technology and the way it's kind of interfaced with our culture. I mean, obviously, it's a great thing. We're able to have a conversation now, and other people are able to hear it, which is wonderful. And of course, as you said, there are people in places in the world who may have had actually no access whatsoever to classical music, which they can hear, the far more than anybody 50 years ago would have been able to have access to, even in the wealthiest echelons of society. On the other hand, I do think we live in a culture that's increasingly at risk of, commodification is the first thing, which is kind of ultra standardization, increasing, kind of instituting boundaries on what's profitable, what's not profitable, what works, what doesn't work, even though there's a very arbitrary kind of lines a lot of the time. And I think obviously the most important thing is actually the way our attention is being cultivated. We've all seen it. If you go onto any given bus or train anywhere in the country, you can find a slew of people who are sort of scrolling endlessly on their phones. And I'm sure everybody's guilty of this in one sense or another, but I do think it has an immensely deleterious effect on our ability to perceive depth. Actually, I think it's the ability to perceive. It's like a muscle. Actually,
it is.
And I wonder how in terms of how classical music's presented. What do you think the future of this? Because obviously, we recent headlines, for example, I know the CBSO said something along the lines of allowing people to use phones in concerts. Personally, I'm against it for the simple reason that it interferes with the enjoyment for other people, and I think it's somewhat disrespectful to the musicians, because obviously
I must say I recently played with them, and I don't think.
Well, I highly doubt that many people actually did it. No.
I mean, I have played in places where people were on their phones, and you notice it. I did not notice it there.
Well, I mean, that's wonderful. It means the audience is actually, being respectful, actually. Yeah. But it's interesting to me that there are... it's not just one person, but I've come across quite a few people that seem to want to try to... I don't know, it's the culture of dilute the culture of appreciating classical music.
Yeah, dilute the experience.
Dilute the experience. And I think it's kind of trying to introduce more mundane objects into a world of the sublime, which is that's
a very good way of putting it. I think one of the inevitable impacts of technology is instant gratification and getting a result immediately. And well, of course, it has its advantages in terms of efficiency. It does go, I think, very much against the spirit of great art, because the whole point of great art is that it forces you to look at it in a certain way. It forces you to make an effort to
absolutely, yeah. I think it's almost like a moment, actually. At least this is how I've always experienced, the interacting with great art. Is often there's a moment where you have to almost sacrifice a little bit of yourself.
Oh yes,
there's a kind of there's a sacrifice of judgment on your part, almost.
Absolutely,
to kind of closer and keep that sort of openness within the mind.
And absolutely, and with certain works of art, that's very pronounced.
Yeah.
let's say, pieces of music that you listen to the first time.
Bruckner symphonies, I often find that. I mean, first listening, I'm sort of baffled, and then after successive listens, it kind of immediately becomes material. It arrives.
You imbibe it. I had that. I mean, I had that with some Beethoven string quartets, which I was instantly moved by, but I couldn't quite, wrap my head around.
Yeah.
I guess I still cannot nowadays. It's a project of a lifetime, but you know that you listen to it the first time, you don't quite get it, and you know that it calls on you to return to it. Yes. And that's really the opposite of instant gratification, where you get what you want at this spur of a moment. I think really the antidote to that is to consciously acknowledge that the essence of great art is the opposite of something instant. Mm-hmm. And the second thing is to really train yourself to listen in that way. And there's a bit of a danger when we, even musicians, when they listen to recordings on the internet, that they listen in a slightly superficial way. And I'm definitely guilty of that myself. Mm-hmm. But an interesting exercise to do for me is to listen to, for example, recordings from the past of people we cannot hear anymore in the concert hall, and really try to listen as though we're in the concert and we cannot get up and leave if we don't like what the performer does. Because of course, you listen on your phone to recordings of Beethoven quartets, and you basically can listen to it the way you scroll on a dating app.
Yeah, it's only a click away.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, you just swipe left, and you like the exposition, then they do something you don't like in the development next. Yeah. Yeah. The interesting thing to do is to let's say listen to a recording of a Bruckner symphony. I did that recently with the Ninth. I listened to a few recordings. Mm-hmm. And listen to the whole thing in a completely, not non-judgmental, but to forget that you can stop the recording.
Almost let it sort of wash over you.
Let it wash over you, forget that you can stop the recording if you don't like it. And by the end of it, you'll find it's an immensely gratifying experience, because you don't just listen to old recordings and revere them for the sake of them being old, but you know why you like them or why you don't like them, what you like about them, and I find that to be a much more...
I mean, it's quite fascinating, because what you're describing, I mean, it has a lot of religious overtones, actually, in the sense that, for example, I attend an Anglo-Catholic Mass every week, and, especially in the early days where I attended church, you could sometimes sort of blank out for moments, and obviously you're in a church, you can't just simply get up and walk out. I mean, you could, I suppose, but when you're when I'm sat in a choir stand, because I sing as well, I do a lot of singing in the church, it would be awfully embarrassing to just sort of step in front of the altar and say, okay, I'm off, bye. But what's fascinating is that you do have those moments where you sort of come in to attention, out of attention, and then back into attention once more, and then there's occasionally those moments where things sort of speak out to you. And over time as well, I mean, definitely with successive attendances, there are certain features, like, for example, with the communion, the significance of the Eucharist, it kind of it becomes more layered with each successive experience. It's quite fascinating to see that. Yeah, and
the more you engage in something, the more you know what it is that keeps your attention, what it is that makes your mind wander away. Yeah, you know why you react in a certain way to something. Yes, there's definitely a lot in common in that. You're engaging in something that you cannot ever describe in words accurately. Yeah, you can try to do it, and certain people do it very well, but there will always be this realm of mystery.
Well, I mean, that's one of the sort of declarations, actually, when the sort of Eucharist is being blessed, is the mystery of faith. Right. There's a moment of announcement where it's kind of acknowledged that there's a fundamentally mysterious quality about what's actually going on here. This transfiguration. Yeah.
Well, I'd say in the musical experience, the mystery actually comes, or it should come, with with a dose of trust, though, or faith.
Yeah.
Indeed, that you listen to a piece of music you really love, and you know that no matter how many times you listen to it, you will be surprised when the composer wants you to be surprised.
Yes, that makes
that's what I get whenever I listen to the Ring Cycle, whenever I listen to Schumann Lieder, whenever I listen to Beethoven Quartet. Even when you recreate the experience, in a way you're experiencing the surprise, the mystery for the first time. And that's why you come back to it, because you crave that. You need that in your mind.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, it is, as you were saying, it's almost a kind of delayed gratification. Actually,
yeah,
it's kind of latent potential, something that wells up within you.
And the reason I think that music is also a soft spot for people who have a very sober view of the world is that it will always remain shrouded in...
It's almost a retreat, actually.
In the inexplicable. I remember a couple of years ago I heard Ian McEwan talk at the Royal Festival Hall, and as his novels reflect, he is an extremely sober man. I mean, he really has no time for anything that reeks of voodoo, so to speak, and he said something quite remarkable in that interview. He said that music is the only thing that makes him glimpse into the realm of genius. He said something to the effect of, I was looking this morning at the score of a Gigue of a Bach partita, which I dearly love, and there I was holding the score, and basically it boils down to a bunch of black dots on a page. And that's it. And of course you could say that that's a bit facile to put it in these words, but I think he actually touched upon something quite profound, in that these black dots get transformed into something of transcendent value.
Oh, it's absolutely
almost.
It's a transcendent category, because
it is. Yeah,
you're taking something that can be reduced down to something very material and sort of actually dead in many ways. It's just ink on a page is essentially it's a dead thing.
And it doesn't allow you. It doesn't allow you to revert to a certain object. I mean, if you look at a great painting, you could say, let's say, if the painting is of a castle somewhere, you could say about a great painting that the castle is very beautiful.
Yeah.
A Bach partita doesn't allow you to do that, because it doesn't describe a castle or a landscape or anything, at least not
explicitly. No, not.
So
I mean,
it makes you focus on one moment in time. And
I think the music has this kind of like revelatory aspect. I think in that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it's absolutely a revelation, because it's kind of has an emergent quality, kind of emergent properties, where it kind of unfolds from mere sound, which is obviously just simple, in a physical sense, mere vibrations of air,
just noise,
to something that becomes, as concrete as, well, anything really. It's meaning, essentially, encoded.
Yeah, well, it's the relationship between content and form, which I think makes for great art, and the greatness of the art is somewhere in that correlation or conflict. It could be conflict. I mean, if you listen to the Schumann Humoresque, it is conflict between the content almost punching against the form. And yet that creates something of a truly...
Yeah, it's almost a meaning or narrative that sort of emerges as a consequence of the sum of the parts, almost. Like the thing itself actually emerges out of this kind of coalescence of parts that kind of vibrate with one another, almost.
That's a very, very good way of putting that.
I mean, one of the things I was going to also mention, actually, from the production side of art, it's always fascinated me that obviously we all know there's a sort of tortured genius archetype in music, but I'm actually more fascinated in some ways with the sort of Michelangelos and the Bachs of the world, who sort of live in this sort of almost curiously, I don't know, matter-of-fact, sort of almost perfunctory lifestyle where everything's done almost like a sort of as a sort of simple labour, when in actual fact they're sort of committed to creating. And it kind of comes back to this delayed gratification concept, actually, which, you know, a lot of great creators are actually very orderly and sort of measured people in many ways. I mean, I'm always fascinated with Bach, that he was able to kind of raise. I forget how many children he had. Something like 20 children.
21, yeah, 21,
something like that. And
but most of them didn't survive.
Well, exactly. But he did. You know, he taught several of them, and we all know Carl Philipp Emanuel, Wilhelm Friedman, Johann Christian, and so on. And you know, he worked in the church. He was a cantor and Kapellmeister and whatnot. And out of that, he's able to sort of create really quite sublime works of art on a practically weekly basis at some points.
Almost an industrial basis, yeah.
Yeah, it's incredible, actually. It's really amazing. You know, there's a kind of iterative, very functional quality to it, which is quite fascinating. And I sometimes wonder.
And Brahms also, who burned most of his pieces. I think he burned 8 string quartets before he published the first one.
Yeah, I mean, it's unbelievable. The sort of volume and industriousness of so many of these artists is actually quite extraordinary. And I sort of wonder, in this day and age, is it possible somehow? I mean, you know, to put it bluntly, I wonder if you took somebody like Mozart with his kind of temperament and personality, and then you put him into the world of gaming and pornography and, you know, all these vices and awful, you know, things that will distract the attention. Where would he find the time to compose 40-odd symphonies? And
on the other hand, many great artists were also people of the gutter. I mean, you shouldn't forget that.
Well, that's also true. Yeah.
I mean, well,
that's very true.
Mozart, for once, was not immune to dirty humor.
But it's interesting that the gutter, as it was 200 years ago, and the gutter today are very different, because the axis is also very different. You can literally spend every second of your life in the gutter this day and age. Whereas in previous times, you had to be physically present in the gutter.
Right.
Whereas we have a digital gutter. I mean, in Japanese, is a bit slightly unrelated, but there's a similar phenomenon called hikikomori, which is it's a type of person who never goes out. They literally spend their entire life living a sort of online virtual existence. You know, people with very sensitive and artistically inclined temperaments. I think Mozart was one of those people. I sometimes wonder, you know, are there people in this world who would actually have great creative gifts to offer, and yet are being distracted by these sort of AI algorithm-driven vices?
Well, I mean, I think if they don't get distracted by the vices, they open themselves up to producing great art. Or if they do get distracted by the vices and they can transfigure that into something higher, then that's also, I think, a recipe for great art. But on the tortured artist front, of course there have been many tortured artists, but I think that paints only
a small fraction
of the picture. And
it's just interesting to me that quite often this particular image is quite romanticised in our culture. Actually.
It is very romanticised.
I wonder why that is precisely. I don't know whether it's because it's something that's very distant from most people. Whereas
it is, and it's a good story. It's a good story to tell. It's very redemptive. There's something almost comforting to think that, you know, certain poets or composers went through unimaginable grief, and they just took that grief and turned it into artistic masterpieces, which we listen to and which we read hundreds of years hence. One thing which is interesting for me is to look at the process which certain composers took on the way to arriving at the destination, which is a great work. For example, you see that with Beethoven and his different catchings of material, and the transformation which that went through. The one example that comes to mind is the last line of the Diabelli Variations.
Okay.
The last 4 bars. He had 2 earlier versions of the very ending of that. The first is completely banal and commonplace. The second is a little bit better. And the third time, he came up with this slithering scale, which is basically a normal scale with a few chromatic notes interspersed. It has almost a sly effect, and it's a remarkable ending. But that didn't just come to him.
It didn't emerge out.
It didn't emerge out of nowhere.
I mean, the list. Actually, funnily enough, the Liszt sonata, which I've been reviewing recently, is
the ending of that.
Yeah, the ending is quite dramatically different.
Oh yes.
The original writing, which was sort of like a virtuoso finish.
Thank goodness for that. Yes.
And now somehow, whenever I play that final coda, the ending of the Liszt sonata, it really feels like you've sort of climbed the mountain and you're sort of just gazing over the kind of the topography of what you've travelled, because it has
yes. But I remember when I played it, I tried to when I got to the coda, I almost tried to imagine myself at a juncture that I could go one way or I could go the other, and it's tempting to go into the bombastic ending of it, but then you go the other way, and that I found quite a helpful.
I think one of the great endings of romantic literature. Absolutely. One of the great pieces of romantic.
And the first volume of Années de Pèlerinage, you get the same thing, because almost every movement has an earlier version, which is a lot more verbose in terms of number of notes, but doesn't say nearly as much as what became.
Well, very much so.
So in a way, I think the mundane adds up to something transcendent if the mundane is in the right hands.
Yeah, I think it would be like hierarchically ordered in some ways.
Oh yes, very much so. And one recent fascination of mine has been works of great composers which are not necessarily their greatest works, but could have only been written by a great composer. Not the master's shavings, which I was never interested in particularly, but there are a couple of Schubert works, which aren't by no means his greatest, but yet they could have only been written by Schubert. I'd say the same thing. Maybe some people would disagree with me. I would say the same thing about Turandot, which I would not quite call a masterpiece. But yet it needed a master in order to,
Yeah, I suppose there are marks, there are sort of footprints almost.
Yes.
On the compositional, the shape, and the kind of overall conception as well. I mean, I guess I often think of some of Rachmaninoff's works in this way, actually. I mean, he was famously sort of perfectionist in a lot of the way he wrote in lots of ways, but obviously I think most people would agree that not all of his works are equally great, but I still think that there's always this kind of indelible mark that is left on everything, even from the very earliest works like the Elegy, for example, which is kind of a juvenile work in a lot of ways, but that somehow there's a mark there, sort of stamp.
It has its dignity.
It can't be anybody but Rachmaninoff somehow. It's a very strange stylistic effect, actually, which I've still not been able to quite find words to express that.
And you probably
Scriabin as well, to be honest. Scriabin I also find a similar quality.
Scriabin,
yeah.
Oh, definitely.
Where some of his more Chopinian style, influenced works in his early period, there's a still strange compilation of elements which
there's something
even in much later works.
There's something combustible which you don't necessarily get in Chopin.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, it has the same shape as Chopin, but it has a tinderbox inside. It doesn't go off, but you think it might go off at any moment.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And that's really the.
It has the scent as well. There's a sort of the aroma of the composer that can't be removed somehow.
Or another interesting case is Fauré, a composer I'm endlessly fascinated with. I'm not. He doesn't come naturally to me, and I find that there's certain works which I'm fascinated with, and yet they elude me. But you almost feel grateful that they exist, even if you don't necessarily like them. They cover a corner of the emotional gamut that needs to be covered.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing with Fauré actually is, some people might think I'm being a bit rude about it here, but I almost think his musical writing is it's necessary to actually find Debussy and Ravel in a lot of ways. The kind of, there's a particular, I don't know, colour, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
And again, to talk about perfume, there's a sort of perfume in Debussy, for example, that I can sort of find certain notes in.
Yes, maybe, but
there's a scent in Fauré which allowed the door to be opened.
Oh yeah,
almost.
Perhaps, yeah.
That's what it feels like. Whenever I've heard Fauré, because obviously he was much older than Debussy.
Much
I don't know
older,
about
the generation.
Yeah, exactly, it's a sort of previous generation,
Yeah.
but there's a lot of moments where you sort of think, well, had he not been there, I mean, I'm absolutely sure Debussy will have been aware of his work.
Oh yes, I mean,
so,
and well, Debussy definitely wanted to prove himself as a better composer.
well,
yeah.
So it's fascinating.
But
there's this kind of somewhere.
Yeah, the only difference being, I think Debussy was much more of a schoolmaster in his composition than Fauré. I mean, Debussy has a didactic element
to
him, which I don't really hear in Fauré. You do get it in Ravel to a certain extent, or even actually to a great extent. But in Debussy, I think it's more pronounced.
Have you played much?
I do play quite a lot of Debussy.
Okay.
I have played Ravel. I have played some Ravel, more in the past than now. I think Debussy comes a bit more naturally to me.
Okay.
I have the second book of Preludes planned for.
Oh, wonderful!
For the future, which is.
I've played most of the first book, but I've not played any from the second book actually.
Yeah, the second it's been a work that daunted me on a spiritual level for a long time because of its almost unremitting tragedy and pessimism, borderline cynicism, I'd say even.
Okay.
And yet it reaches these epiphanies which you get almost don't get anywhere else.
Absolutely, yeah. And the things I find fascinating about playing a lot of Debussy and Ravel, I'm almost feeling bad for putting them in the same box because they're very different.
They're very different.
But it's interesting that obviously living in the 21st century, and obviously film music in particular being so prevalent, as almost like a separate art form in itself. I'm always amazed at the sheer influence and aesthetic that both Debussy and Ravel have had on the way people kind of create atmosphere and the way people produce this like scent of a location.
And it's almost.
In the case of Ravel, orchestration. Of course. I mean, Ravel has a huge. I mean, Debussy as well. You can hear footprints of La Mer in lots of film soundtracks,
and don't you find it hard to listen to La Mer right now without thinking of at the end of the first movement of La Mer, I just cannot help but think of the credits rolling at the end of a movie.
Oh well, I was just thinking of Eastbourne, but
Right. Well, that's what you're supposed to be thinking of course. I haven't been there. Maybe that's.
No, I've actually never. But I'm sure it's a wonderful place. Debussy obviously liked it enough. So.
Yes, and I believe the English audiences appreciated La Mer before French audiences did.
Okay, that is interesting.
Yes, much to England's credit. But yes, this harp glissando has become so minted in our minds.
Aesthetic push that you find in a lot of Debussy and Ravel's writing, it just seems to have made such a huge mark on the shape of a lot of modern. What would you call? Film music, sort of something more than it's kind of anything that's sort of depicting something is sort of this picturesque quality. I think that's why people often describe them as sort of impressionists, even though impressionism is usually wrongly. It's usually to describe Monet and so the painters. But it's interesting that people instinctively want to put that label to them because I think there's this sort of strange quality. You take something like Reflet dans l'eau, and you can almost hear a montage. You can almost visualize a montage of ripples of water and this kind of shimmering effect and these
Yes,
kind
but
of
on the other hand,
visual
it's interesting
quality.
to sometimes imagine these works without the titles.
Without the title,
And
yeah.
of course, the preludes, the titles come at the end of the prelude, and they're in
Well,
brackets.
it's a very fascinating topic actually. I mean, I don't know how much time we have to talk about that, but I remember when I was preparing Ravel's
Hmm.
Miroir for a concert, and I was in Okinawa in Japan on a holiday, and this kind lady who's the auntie of an Airbnb host I had, she had a piano, and I needed to practice for the concert after the holiday, so I spent maybe a couple of hours a day
Yeah,
going to her house to practice, so I could not feel guilty going
I know
out.
the feeling.
And what was fascinating is this lady had never heard Miroir
Hmm.
before. She didn't know it at all. She wasn't, she wasn't classic. She wasn't trained as a pianist. She just liked sort of dabbling on the piano.
Right.
And I was playing through Un Bach sur le Champ. Sorry for my French. And what's fascinating is I said to her, "What do you think this piece is about?" And she said, "Oh, it feels like a boat on the ocean." And
Wow.
I was quite sort of flabbergasted by that because I thought, my goodness, I mean, I don't know. She said, "Oh no," I mean, I took it as a compliment because she said, "Oh, you really got the sense of sort of waves
Course.
and something."
No, you're
a
obviously
sense of
doing
emotion.
something right.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. It
That's
sort of changed the life
that's
for her. I was shocked. I was quite taken aback by it, to be perfectly honest.
that is remarkable. Well, it just goes to show the mastery of both composer and performer, because that's in a way the very response you want to get with such a piece. It's interesting when people make these comments about works which don't have a descriptive title.
Oh yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, there were many composers who sort of shunned having
Who should,
titles.
yeah.
Hence why you take somebody like Chopin, Prelude number one, Waltz number one. It's just very sort of pedestrian titles without trying to allude to too much. But it actually comes back to the topic we discussed earlier about how in some ways you don't want to put your finger
Precisely.
you don't want to be explicit about what the content is, because as soon as you try to touch it, it kind of vanishes under your fingers.
Yes, and
it's like trying to
needs
grab
to-
hold of smoke or something.
Is exactly. It needs to
Yeah.
be. It needs to remain in the realm of the mysterious and of the inexplicable, and you just need to believe that what it's saying is true,
Yeah.
and and I think that's how you get to the essence of it, rather than trying to ascribe certain names to it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenging things actually I find, because obviously it's a conversation that's sort of hot topic in classical music these days, is how to sort of invite new audiences. And I notice there's a sort of slightly, I'm going to say, a quite lazy approach to promoting classical music.
Yes.
Usually in the form of Mozart reimagined, or rethinking Beethoven or something along those lines. It's always trying to
the prefix is
recreate.
always re.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You got it. And I think one of the challenges that we face actually is, as I say, there's a tendency to be quite skeptical in our culture. I feel about, because what you said was very interesting. Is that you have to sort of believe in the truth, the mystery. But I feel that there's a great deal of skepticism, and what's interesting is how do we find a pathway, or even from a promotional point of view, a way of kind of explicating or sharing in the mystery, the truth of the mystery with prospective audiences? Or do you think that's necessarily a sort of individual thing, that's something people have to arrive at it completely independently and voluntarily?
Well, wow, that's a good question.
It's a question.
It's a good question, and I have a few threads which I'll try to make sense of. I think ultimately, yes, it's an individual experience, because a promoter might convince you to go and see an opera, but you will experience the opera yourself. The promoter cannot experience it for you.
Yeah.
So ultimately it is an individual.
So do you think it's something that can't? Do you think there's something that can't be marketed, and that's why
Well,
we've sort of struggled with it a little bit?
Yes, and then the next question is how do we explain it? How do we present it? Even for the sake of honesty, I would be hesitant to embrace the, for lack of a better word, cheapening of the experience.
Yeah.
I mean, what is Mozart reimagined? Mozart doesn't need to be reimagined. I mean, we reimagine him through the centuries.
Exactly.
Mozart gets reimagined up here. You don't need to do it for me.
Yeah.
So even for the sake of not lying to our audience, I think we should be very skeptical of attempts to dilute the experience.
Yeah.
At a more fundamental level, I think, especially in an increasingly fast-moving world, the need for something beyond the here and now remains.
Absolutely.
No matter.
It's a thirst, actually.
Yeah. No matter how advanced our world is, no matter how many new gadgets we can purchase, there is something rooted in human nature which responds to certain things and which can be tapped into, which we need. And that's really where I think great art comes in. That's its purpose. That's its task almost. And that's why I have to avert my gaze sometimes when I see certain advertisements.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's one of those things as well. I mean, an interesting conversation I had with a friend of mine, and probably something I'll probably talk about on this podcast at some point, is the role of some AI in our society and the creation of AI. I mean, I hesitate to even use the word art because I wouldn't really consider it art in the conventional sense. It's just sort of AI content creation, for lack of a better term. And it's interesting. I mean, I've said for many years that I do think that performers, particularly, and composers to an extent as well, I think will be in great need by society once AI has effectively taken over our society, taken over the world as it is, as we know it. And I think that's primarily because, as we've talked about in this podcast, art is not something which can really be understood as an amalgamation of just simple objects, but actually is something that is revealed. It's something that emerges, it acts as an emergent property beyond that. And not just the sum of its parts either, but something that's kind of it's an
exceeds the sum of its parts. Yeah,
exactly. It's a sort of intentionality on the role of the creator,
but actually,
the human experience.
The question of which you brought up about AI, that touches on an interesting point, because at least the way I understand it, the AI cannot produce an original thought of its own. It's an aggregator of the data that gets put into it.
Precisely. Yeah.
Now, you or I could study the style of a third-rate composer from the 18th century.
Yeah.
And then, I don't mean to be disparaging here, but I think we could write a string quartet which would be indistinguishable from
a decent imitation, basically.
From a third-rate composer of the Rococo. And yet, you and I can study Haydn quartets till the day we drop dead, and we won't be able to write a movement of a Haydn quartet.
Precisely, yeah.
And it's the same with AI poetry. I mean, I remember the first time I saw ChatGPT, I was sitting with a few friends, and
I played around with it a lot myself.
Well, who hasn't by now? And we dropped all sorts of things into it. Write a poem in the style of this, in the style of that, and it, of course, it mastered all of the linguistic parameters.
It's a superficial quality.
But what it doesn't, what AI cannot understand is aesthetics, and we were laughing at the AI poems that we were given. Of course, I mean, that was a while ago, and it probably improved since. And I'm sure it could fool some people pretty well. Maybe it could even fool me on a certain level if it's done deftly.
Yeah, well, I think it's also.
But on the other hand, it will only ever remain a sum of its parts, and art, in the sense that we know it, in the sense that we crave it, is never just a sum of its parts.
Yeah, well, exactly, and I think besides aesthetics, I think AI can't really understand ethic either. It doesn't
No.
understand an underlying ethic for why you might create in the first place. What's its purpose?
Well, some artists
Yeah.
had a skewed understanding of ethics.
They're never intrinsically linked. I mean,
No.
for me personally, I think it should be ethics then aesthetics. Although some people take it the other way around. But
Yeah.
that's
Well,
that's a
it
debate.
shouldn't be one at the expense of the other, I think.
Yeah, yeah, that's very true.
Yeah, but I think it's a good idea not to be apologetic about the mysterious aspect of art, the inexplicable.
Be
The
promoted more
inexplicable
heavily,
nature.
actually.
Exactly.
That's my
I
opinion.
mean,
That's my opinion on the sort of music industry as it is. I think people need to tap into that aspect.
exactly.
I mean, one thing I found quite remarkable in some of the concerts I've done is, you can sometimes go to areas of the country that, unlike London, which has, concerts every single night, there's
Yeah.
culture virtually sort of bursting from the seams. You don't have to look very hard to find a concert.
No.
You can go to some places where there aren't many concerts, and invariably some of the audience members may have never actually, this may be the very first concert they've ever attended.
Yep. Yep.
And what I can find fascinating is that when the audience member is kind of invited to participate and given a kind of set of implicit instructions almost, which is, let's sit quietly, don't bring your bottle of Coca-Cola and spray it all over the seats. Don't be eating popcorn. Just sit still and enjoy it. Listen to the music. Just let it wash over you. Let it take it in. I mean, some of the conversations I've had have been remarkable. Like really, truly remarkable. The perceptiveness of some people can really astound you. And I often find that's very much the opposite of what I think a lot of the industry has done, which is dumbing down. It's actually the opposite.
And it's
actually getting people to rise.
Yes, and it's based on a set of assumptions which I'm very skeptical of. I experienced that firsthand on many occasions. This particular season, my main work is the Max Reger Bach Variations, which
I think I heard you play it in Stoke.
Yes, exactly.
Right? Yeah,
that's
wonderful piece.
It is, but it's goodness knows not a particularly popular piece, or not. It doesn't correspond to our modern parameters of being accessible, and
True.
yet
True.
And yet, some of the warmest responses I've received with that piece were in places which are, so to speak, remote.
Yeah.
So very much off Wigmore Hall in terms of the landscape, the audience. Obviously, these places have not had this piece programmed. Most of the audience, safe to assume, have not heard any Reger before, and yet, when they're in the presence of this great work, it taps into something and they respond. I had the very similar experience in Argentina 2 years ago on a tour where I was taken to places which are really remote. So not remote by UK standards, but remote by real world standards, in the mountains.
Did you by any chance ever visit a little place called Trelew?
No.
In Patagonia.
No, I was in the other end of the country, northwest, and I was playing the Hammerklavier, and I really don't mean to be disparaging or supercilious, but you could see that there's not a lot of classical music in that specific part of the world, and I came with a program which, I mean, even for me was heavy. I played the 2 Schumann pieces, Third Book of Iberia, and the Hammerklavier.
Oh wow, good program.
And the Hammerklavier went down as it would have gone down in any hub of classical music. There was no bewilderment beyond the bewilderment that you need to feel when you listen to such a work.
The audience is like the Musikverein in the mountains.
No, basically, I mean, and in a way, it's almost a bigger responsibility to play these works for people who are hearing it for the first time. Mm-hmm. Because if I play the Hammerklavier badly in London, people will think I'm a bad pianist, and it's okay. Mm-hmm. If I play the Hammerklavier badly to an audience that has never heard it before, they might think that Beethoven is a bad composer, and that's not okay. Yeah. So I really try to reject any distinction of this piece is suitable for this audience but not for
Oh, I
that
totally agree.
audience.
Yeah,
I
I've made
mean,
many times myself with the
great
promotions.
great music is suitable for the human psyche. That's why it's
Absolutely, yeah.
there. That's why it survived over generations. I mean, there's a reason why there are only a few composers from Vienna in the 1780s that we listen to,
Yeah.
because we deem them essential to our emotional, psychological, and spiritual well-being. And
Hmm.
that doesn't change with time. That is not something that will be brushed away by a new gadget or by something that the internet will be able to do. It certainly won't be supplanted by machine learning.
I
It,
shouldn't think
uh,
so.
it goes against the very nature of what it is. And I don't think we should apologize for that. I think we should be
No, yeah.
rather
As I
happy with
say,
that.
I think there should be a great deal of effort made to actually encourage people to engage
Yes,
specifically with that aspect, actually, rather than shy away from it.
of
Because, like I
course.
say, I tend to find that there's a little bit of a tendency here and there for people to kind of almost be slightly embarrassed by that aspect, as if it's a bit stuffy or something, which is a very odd thing because it's the kind of central quality
It,
of the music itself. Actually, it's the sublime aspect is the thing that you go there for in the first place,
it's
not the thing that.
it's the thing that you go there for in the first place, and it's also the great equalizer between the performer and the audience. I find. I mean, I certainly know that I cannot get to the bottom of the great works that I'm privileged enough to take on stage.
Yeah, you sort of act as a vehicle basically to
You
its
act as a
recreation.
vehicle, but you are every bit as bewildered by them as the audience is at a certain level. And in fact, I don't know if you, I definitely found that when I go to a concert now, I don't want to go as a musician. I don't go to a concert in order to carefully listen to every single thing that the performer does and to be able to critique it from the point of view of somebody who's in the field. I
Yeah,
really
it's
go
certainly a
there.
habit that tried hard to avoid actually, because I have had this trouble sometimes where you sort of listen for different things, and you
Well,
sort of
it was
you don't
interesting.
switch off because the way you listen to your own playing and the way you listen to someone else is not necessarily the same thing.
Of course
And
not. Yeah, it
shouldn't be
cannot be.
it shouldn't be the same thing. But
No, no, and
sometimes
it cannot
it
be.
becomes a habit. It becomes like a
But
habit sometimes to try and listen for these like tiny minutiae.
But it's
Um,
interesting because when I moved to London, in my first year, I went to at a bare minimum, 5 concerts a week.
oh wow, that's very dedicated.
Sometimes between the Barbican Festival Hall, Wigmore, lunchtime concerts, and concerts at the Academy, I would have easily gone to 9 concerts a week.
Yeah,
By my second year, I cut that number by probably about 60-70%. And then by the third year, I cut that by about half.
did you feel
Why?
like you were oversaturated?
Well, I felt that I've heard the names that there are to hear, and
Yes.
basically, if I buy a ticket for a concert, I carve out 2-3 hours from my schedule. I want to be moved. That's
Yeah.
why I go. I I don't go to see what will this person do in this bar.
Yeah.
I mean, that might be curious in a fleeting sort of way, but that's not what's going to get me to buy a ticket and go to a concert hall. I I just want to be moved. I want to be taken on a journey. I want to be
Absolutely.
told a story. I want to have the composer's world brought into my own sphere, and that's why that is the
Yeah, I
prime
mean,
reason for going to a concert.
you can definitely find yourself to be sort of oversaturated, and it's that thing of gratification. It becomes instant if you're watching concerts all the time. I mean, I don't know about you, but I remember when the pandemic
Hmm.
finished.
Yeah,
The first concert I went to watch was a sort of small lunchtime concert in
yeah,
Manchester, not by a musician of great renown or fame, but I remember the sort of sense of awe, a
yeah.
sense of great euphoria actually.
Yeah,
Or
yeah,
just just the sensory quality of hearing a live instrument again after just being totally online all the time.
yes, yes. It's the sense of that's what it's like.
Yes,
And
yeah, and
it was also
overwhelmed by joy. Actually, I found
it was also the
yeah.
same. It was also the same experience for me playing the first concert, which was
Yeah.
it was about roughly half a year after the
Yeah.
world shut down, and even sense of being uncomfortable backstage felt a bit like
Sweeter than normal.
a bit like an epiphany that that's what I was waiting to happen. And I don't know about you, but I found the experience of playing to a camera on these live webcasts absolutely intolerable.
Yes.
I found it utterly hideous.
So it felt like playing to a void a lot of the time.
It is on one hand it is playing to a void. On the other hand, I remember one of those quote unquote concerts I did where you had to purchase online tickets.
Yeah.
But you as the performer got a link which you could send to a limited number of people to watch in real time.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And I sent that link to a few friends who were in different parts of the world, I think even in different continents.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't escape the, I don't know, really creepy idea that I know that these people are listening to me, and yet I cannot see them. And with one of them was a close friend, with whom I've spoken at length about, the pieces I was playing.
Yeah.
And she knew what I thought about these pieces, what I thought they should sound like. So presumably she could get into my mind while watching me play. And yet she wasn't there. I finished playing. I turn, and all I see is a bunch of empty seats. It
Some
felt,
wires on the camera.
Yeah, it felt a bit like
It's almost
like
a bit
a horror movie.
Yeah, depersonalization or
Completely,
derealization.
it's completely
Disembodiment. You're sort of a disembodied figure.
Yeah, and not to mention the awkward bow to the audience without applause, which is really embarrassing.
Oh well, it's true. Yeah, it's true. You have to sort of imagine applause.
Imagine,
That's the thing. It's you kind of have to be your own best friend in those kind of situations to imagine. Oh yes, you did very well. In fact, so take triumphant bow. The audience has enjoyed, because obviously normally with a concert you sort of rely on your energy sort of relies a certain degree on the feedback that you get from the audience.
To a certain degree, yeah.
If you've got a very enthusiastic audience, it kind of gives you a little bit of. You realise you're aware that the audience has enjoyed it. Of course, you have to be thick-skinned and ignore it if the audience.
It keeps you afloat. It keeps you afloat on a certain level.
Yeah, I mean, I always feel very different if the audience is extremely engaged. There's a kind of electricity in the room somehow. I don't know. I felt this personally, where you really feel that people are very thoroughly engaged at every note and every second of the performance.
And you feel it, especially in the pauses. That's where really you can get a glimpse into what
it's almost like synchronized. Almost like the breath of the audience is synchronized somehow.
It is, and it's really almost the only place where it can happen, that you can have 2,000 people in complete silence focusing on a single occurrence. It's something that doesn't happen really anywhere else.
It's very rare.
I remember one of the first things Hamish Milne told me the first time I played for him is that the hallmark of a great artist is in the pauses. He says a great actor will hold a pause for just the right amount of time, and a mediocre actor will either cut it short or hold it so long that you begin to lose your attention.
I mean, that sounds actually like a pretty good place to kind of conclude the podcast. Actually, it's interesting. I was sort of trying to keep these podcasts to not too long, and I'm aware that we've managed to talk for an hour.
I just noticed that. Actually.
Which is amazing. So I'm very thankful for you to come on. And I think that's a wonderful place to pause. We should all be listening for the pauses. That's a very integral message of today's inaugural podcast.
Podcast, yes.
I'm sure if you're willing, and I hope you are willing, that we can do this again, because we've got so much left to talk about.
Please.
It'll be hugely enjoyable.
I'd be thrilled to.
For any listeners, have you got any concerts on the horizon that you might want to share with people?
So I am. In 2 days, I'm going to play in Trinity College Chapel in Cambridge.
Oh, wonderful.
Following that, I'm going to be spending some time in Colorado at the Vale Festival.
Brilliant.
Then I come back to the UK and go straight to the Petworth Festival in Kent. Then I will be playing in the North York Moors Chamber Music Festival, which is located in one of the most magical places I've ever been to. It's really a patch of heaven on earth. And in September, if there are any listeners in Central Europe, I will be playing with the Mahler Chamber Orchestra at the Grafenegg Festival in Austria.
Amazing. Really amazing. Well, I urge anybody who's listening to, if they have the opportunity to come and listen to you, because I mean, I've listened to you many times and I've known you for many years, and you're an exceptional artist, and I think if anybody has the opportunity, they should come and hear you. So thanks so much for doing the podcast.
Coming from another very fine artist, it means a lot.
Well, it's very kind of you. Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Let's do it again soon.
Absolutely.
All right.